Hello and welcome to Very British Futures, the podcast that each episode takes a look at a British sci-fi show from the archives. This time we're heading north to a remote Scottish island where something inhuman is preying on the animals and inhabitants, something they call the Nightmare Man. Shown only once in the summer of 1981, this BBC sci-fi horror hybrid has nevertheless built up a cult following in the years since. As ever, I have to warn you there will be spoilers. Joining me to walk through the fog are my friends Ian Taylor and John Isles. Ian Taylor is a writer who's contributed to many magazines about cult movies and television, and recently published All Sorts of Things Might Happen, the films of Jenny Agutter. John Isles has written short stories for Big Finish and acted in and directed award-winning short films with Westlake Films. So, we'll turning back to The Nightmare Man. In 1978, David Wiltshire, a dentist with a sideline as a novelist, sold a sci-fi horror novel called Child of Vodyanoi to the publisher Robert Hale Limited. Then, in 1980, BBC producer Ron Craddock was asked to provide a thriller in 4 half-hour episodes to be shown at 8:20 p.m. on a weekday evening. He considered several recently published novels and eventually settled on Child of Vodyanoi. The adaptation was handed to Robert Holmes, an obvious choice given his association with Doctor Who at a time when it had been pushing tea-time gothic about as far as it could go. Director Douglas Camfield also had strong Doctor Who connections and had built up a reputation for delivering atmospheric action dramas that belied their often modest budgets. The Nightmare Man starred James Warwick, Celia Imrie, Maurice Reeves, Jonathan Newth, and James Cosmo. The programme was eventually released on DVD in 2005, accompanied by an exhaustive booklet of viewing notes by TV historian Andrew Pixley, whose work I am once again indebted to for this episode. I'd also like to recommend the excellent online article by Tristan Sargent, which provided some interesting extra influences. So, Ian, could you sum up the premise of The Nightmare Man for us?
Yes, indeed. I'd be delighted. So the story is set on a fictional Scottish island called Inverdee, a remote place. And the hero of the piece is a dentist, of course, as it would be. And his girlfriend, she works in the local post office, but is also a cartographer. And we first get to meet them. We see a little bit of romance, and then our dentist hero heads off to the local golf course, at which point he discovers a horribly mutilated body. And very soon, the island is gripped in a fair bit of terror. There seems to be a psychopathic killer with bestial tendencies preying on the islanders. Also on the island, there's a mysterious army major who seems to know a little bit more than he should do about what's going on. And as the story unfolds, the police and the army officer, the dentist and his cartographer girlfriend, all mucking together to try and track down the killer, which of course turns out to be something rather unexpected. In the book, I believe, things seem to get revealed a little bit sooner, but it's left as a nice twist. We don't quite know what's going on, but we do find that a mysterious submarine, a one-man submarine, is washed up on the shore, and it turns out that the bestial killer has come out of this submarine. It's all linked in to the Cold War, radiation poisoning, cybernetic engineering. It proves to be very, very atmospheric, with lots of fog rolling in, lots of point of view camera shots with a red tinge.
Well, our first question is when did you first hear about The Nightmare Man? I wonder if we could start with John.
I first heard about it in the pages of either TV Zone or DWB around the 90s. I remember reading about it in a kind of, I think TV's only used to these TV flashback articles, and so it just kind of examined the series of these classics that no one has seen for ages, and have interviews with people involved. And it was just kind of revered as this great, little remembered, never repeated, never released on video at the time series. And obviously, it had a good reputation and pedigree with both Douglas Camfield directing it and Robert Holmes adapting it. You know, it was kind of a sort of love child of Doctor Who and adult drama, I suppose. So I knew of its reputation when I eventually came to watch it because it was an unknown quantity. I never bought the DVD either when it came out, and so I didn't get to watch it until I was invited on to do this podcast. So thank you for giving me that push to watch it, Gareth. And it lived up to expectations. I'll go into it a little bit later, but obviously I knew the twist from reading these articles over the years. So I tried to put myself in the place of forgetting that I knew that it was a human being, you know, cybernetically enhanced and gone mad from radiation poisoning.
How about yourself, Ian?
Well, this is one of those instances where I can proudly say I was there at the time. 1981, I would have been 11 years old, and I do remember watching the series with my mum. It's not really my mum's sort of thing. I don't know why. No, she was watching it with me. I remember her once. I remember her once falling asleep in the cinema watching Warlords of Atlantis. So it's definitely not her sort of thing. But I watched it at the time, and I was a very imaginative child, and I was naturally drawn to horror, sci-fi, fantasy, Lost World, dinosaurs. This was right up my street. I love Doctor Who, and this just had a little bit of edge because it was that little bit more grown up. So I was delighted that it was on at a time a little bit earlier. I was able to watch it. As I say, I watched it with my mum, and it stuck in my memory for a long time. And then I forgot about it, but maybe about 8 years later, I was browsing some second-hand bookshops in Manchester, and I found the TV tie-in version of the novel for the princely sum of 40 pence, which I saved up for. And then bought it. And as soon as the DVD came out, I bought that as well. It's always been something that I've loved, and brilliant. So it's nice because sometimes I look back and I didn't get the chance to watch all of the horror films at the cinema that I love, the Hammer films and stuff like that. It's just really nice to say, yes, I was there when this was first screened and I saw it at the time.
I'm not quite sure why I didn't. Well, I was of a similar age to you, Ian, at the time, and I don't know why I didn't watch this because it would have been completely up my street at the time. I was well into watching any kind of science fiction that turned up on the television. I could only presume possibly I was steered away from it by my parents at the time. It was years later when I was basically involved in fandom and was at a friend's house, and he would mention, "Oh, have you heard of this thing called The Nightmare Man?" And I was amazed that there was something written by Robert Holmes and directed by Douglas Camfield I'd never heard of. And I remember him putting on episode 1, and we watched a bit of it, but it was kind of a general meeting chit chat. It was sort of on in the background on the TV. And it wasn't until quite a few years later, in my tape trading days, that I managed to actually get hold of I think it was probably a third generation copy then, and was very, very impressed with it. So immediately, when I got a chance to get a proper DVD copy, picked it up then. And I think it's very true. In fact, I'll address this now. It does, to me, feel like it's the third part of a trilogy that began in Doctor Who. I mean, this is entirely a very much, I am aware, a very fan perspective. I don't think Robert Holmes or Douglas Camfield probably felt the same. But there seems to be this trilogy, and they all have a similar atmosphere. Oh, it starts with the Tom Baker story, Terror of the Zygons, and moves into another Tom Baker story, Seeds of Doom, and then you get the Nightmare Man, and they're three kind of fairly horrific sci-fi stories that all have a similar kind of chilly atmosphere to them. They have a similar, to me, have quite a similar feel. I don't know if you'd agree with me on that.
Yes, I anticipated your question, Gareth, and I rewatched the first two parts of Terror of the Zygons today. It does feel very similar. It's not as scary, possibly just because you've got the Doctor there, and so I think possibly because of the familiarity with the characters, it doesn't feel as adult or scary as Nightmare Man. And probably same for Seeds of Doom, but you're right, they're probably closest to horror that Doctor Who would get. And obviously they have things in common. Another thing they have in common is in the Nightmare Man, David takes a cast of the bite marks of the first victim and makes a cast. And the Doctor does the same with the Scarison's bite mark from a piece of oil rig.
That's true.
And I'd love to know if Douglas Camfield did even consider any kind of connections or memories of his two Doctor Who stories when he was doing this. Because you're right, they're very similar. Even the scores are similar sounding. They're different composers, but they are of a similar sound, aren't they?
They are quite similar. I must admit, I was a little bit surprised it wasn't Jeffrey Bergen who did the music for the two Doctor Who, but it's very much in his palette.
It is.
On that. Did you see a Doctor Who connection there, Ian?
I think there definitely is, and I find it very difficult to believe that Mr. Camfield didn't pick up on that as well, and maybe just relish being able to go a little bit further with it as well. I suppose
it's definitely more adult.
It is. It absolutely is. But I noticed it does share an actor as well, doesn't it?
Yes. Terror of the Zygons.
Yeah, Tony Sibbald, who plays the Canadian photographer in The Nightmare Man, also crops up in Zygon. So, yeah, there is that little link. But at the end of the day, if you have something monstrous preying on people in a village, it's definitely got its Doctor Who elements of the time, hasn't it? And I mean, we might arguably say the best years of Doctor Who.
I was going to also mention, do you remember when John Nathan Turner took over as producer on Doctor Who? He wanted a clean slate, and he rejected Douglas Camfield's offer to come and direct something for him because he originally, J&T offered him the 5 Doctors, and basically Camfield said no because you effectively sacked me back in 1980, and he held that against him all that time.
Oh, I did not know that story.
And so I wonder if this was his kind of attempt to do Doctor Who again, because I mean he did all kinds of things, didn't he? Police dramas. I don't know if he did any Play for Today type things. I know he did things like Professionals, Shoestring, all kinds of stuff. You know, you look at say Shoestring, and just from the editing and the camera work, you just think this is going to be a Douglas Camfield one. So you look at the end credits, Douglas Camfield. But one thing I was going to say about Camfield is that everything that I've seen him direct, there isn't a duff acting performance at all, and that just goes to show that actors can be good or bad depending on your director, and it shows that he was good with actors as well as the technical side of it, with the camera work and the editing. He also got on well with actors, I believe, and would get a good performance. You know, you look at I've forgotten his name, John Chalice in the Seeds of Doom.
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't think that was Boise from Only Fools and Horses, would you? He's so different.
Very different performance.
I know. Yes, he's a right nasty piece of work in Seeds of Doom. It's and it's unusual. Usually, directors seem to go towards it's a kind of left brain, right brain thing. They seem to you get those better on the technical side, and or those that are better working with actors. But I think you're quite right. I mean, Douglas Camfield was a great all rounder.
And also say that he was a bit of a mentor figure, I think, for Graham Harper, because Graham Harper has a similar reputation as a modern-day director of Doctor Who and some of the classic Doctor Who as well. And he was his production manager on Doctor Who and on this one as well. The Nightmare Man, wasn't he?
I did notice his name, yeah.
And I just wondered, obviously they'd worked together. He'd obviously nurtured Harper, I suppose.
Now, as you inferred a little earlier, Ian, you have an advantage over myself and John, in that you have read the novel.
It's got silly money on eBay right now, so I wasn't able to.
Sadly, it was beyond the podcast budget, I'm afraid, to get hold of a copy. But I would love to know what you think of it, first of all, as a novel.
Well, it was well worth the 40p that I paid for it, I'll say that.
A bit of inflation.
Yeah, just a bit, yeah. I'll keep hold of that. I'm very glad to hear that. It's a good read. It is. It's very much of its time. It was the late 70s when it was first published, and it belongs alongside those other writers of the time, James Herberts and Sean Hudson, who might be starting round about then. Probably a step up from Guy N. Smith, who I nevertheless enjoy reading now and again when I don't want to challenge myself too much. But it's a step up from that. It's an entertaining book. Perhaps it seems a bit strange that the submarine is actually referred to in the very first chapter before we even know what's going on, and it kind of is suggestive of what might be going on, which is something they don't do in the actual serial. They delay that for quite a while. But otherwise, yeah, absolutely excellent. There are very few changes, to be honest. I'm surprised he didn't write more of that ilk. It seems that he stopped after a short while, David Wiltshire, and then came back in the 2000s as a romantic novel.
Yes, I agree, because he wrote this. There was an earlier story called the with the possibly slightly problematic title of The Homo Saw.
Yeah.
Which about a sort of lizard man, loose, and then a later one called Genesis 2. Both actually sound quite intriguing, and if I ever do see them in a second-hand bookshop, I will pick them up. And I'm glad you mentioned Sean Hudson and James Herbert, because when I read the synopsis in the viewing notes, it very much leapt out to me. It was very much part of that 70s British horror tradition, really, that was kicked off by The Rats by James Herbert.
Was that about 74 or 75, The Rats?
The Rats was, I believe.
And in fact, I'm kind of surprised in a way that at the time that film and TV makers didn't exploit this little genre a bit more, because they were some of those books were like international bestsellers, things like Rats and Sean Hudson's Spawn and the like.
Have you seen the film of The Rats, Gareth?
Well, they were massive, and
didn't we put masks over dogs' heads?
I suppose that is part of the trouble. I mean, I've got a soft spot in a way for 70s films because they don't have all that CGI way of doing things. I quite like sometimes the ingenuity, even if it's not always successful. I sometimes quite like the ingenuity of makers.
Didn't they make a film based on Slugs, the Sean Hudson novel, as well?
Yes.
I'm sure I've seen that.
Yeah, dreadful.
But I can't remember much about it.
I think I've heard it's dreadful. I think Sean Hudson himself said it was. It's very kind that people are providing work for actors with no brains. So.
I read a review of the film, which included comments on the fact that they watched it at the premiere, and Sean Hudson was there, and he left the screening looking very pale indeed. I don't think it was because he was scared.
No. The book is a little bit more extreme in some ways than obviously what you could show on BBC at 8:30, particularly with the nature of the killer and what he does.
That's right. Yeah, the first victim, the lady that's discovered on the golf course, which she's in the TV version, of course, but we never get to find out very much, really. We see her disembarking from a ferry, and then next time we see her, she's dead. Whereas the first chapter of the book does focus on her finding the sub, going back to her own cottage, and finding this nightmare man actually inside. And yeah, there is sexual assault involved, which obviously is not something that we'd be putting on the BBC at 8:20.
And as you said, it would give too much of a story away, wouldn't it, if they'd featured that? There'd be no mystery.
It surprised me. It really did surprise me. I think it indicates really that a lot of the book is about the tension of this creature stalking people. In that way, it is less of a mystery than the actual TV serial was, which I think works in the serial's favour.
Yes,
definitely. I mean, I can remember the first time I watched The Nightmare Man. There was a real intrigue in what this assailant was. You know, we just saw that red tinged sort of like his red tinged point of view. And at this point, it's like, is it a man? Is it a werewolf of some kind? Or
there's
an alien?
Two things I was going to say about that. The first is the heavy breathing. Well, I said it's exactly the same noise our 12-year-old son makes when he's pretending to be killed or squashed. You know, that's what she said when she was watching it with me for a little bit. And the other thing was that it's interesting seeing a red tinge for that point of view rather than the traditional green, which is in Doctor Who. It's always green when it's a monster point of view, isn't it?
I was thinking if they were doing that now, they might have been tempted to add a few sort of in-vision graphics and stuff. He's meant to be this sort of cyborg.
Oh yes.
But I'm glad they didn't, because it would have given it away. Or
yeah,
I have
to say that at the time, although I was fairly young, but at the time I had no idea where it was going. I had no idea what the creature was. So the build up of that mystery was incredibly effective. I had no idea at all. So it was a fantastic twist for me at the age of 11.
I love the idea. Comes out about the nature, the sort of cybernetic nature of this nightmare. I thought, what a brilliant idea, and I particularly like the idea that kind of half his brain is still in the submarine. I thought that was a really good idea. In fact, to be honest, watching it back, in my mind, that idea was so strong. I was really surprised watching it back for this podcast that's actually not very much played upon in the actual episode. You get that bit that's kind of just reported where the policeman says this submarine's been making funny sounds, sort of like it's sort of twitching. I think it would have. I must admit here, I think it would have been better if we'd actually seen and heard that, and somehow seen perhaps a few twitches from the submarine.
I was just gonna say the submarine looks a bit cheap. That's my only negative, really. That unfortunately it just looks a little cheap.
They do manage to lift it very easily, don't they?
It's made of special alloy, Ian. It's a special new alloy that makes it very light, so it can manoeuvre better underwater.
I know what you mean. It does look just a little bit too. I mean, I know it's meant to be a one-man attack sub.
Exactly,
But
and I love B movies and I love Doctor Who, but it just lets it down slightly by looking cheap.
The design is basically okay. You could just do it being just a little bit bigger and a little bit more of an engine.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the idea of doing more with the half the brain still being in the sub, but I do think that was a definite plus point of the script, that sometimes these almost throwaway lines, which when you stop to think about them, were quite grotesque. And it sort of played on the imagination during the when they were having a look at that first body, and I think the dentist and the local doctor are talking, and one of them just says, "You mean he did all this with his bare hands?" And we never get to actually really see it, but it just hints. Same as the references to the headless body and things like that. I think
Well, yeah. You can see that when the body's on the slab and the covers on her, that there's like one leg there, and maybe an arm missing, and they just tell us that the head's missing. That's very effective without showing it too much gory detail. And then, as you say, they sort of find her head and stuff back in her cottage, don't they?
It does that sort of the dance of the slow reveal of the monster really well over these 4 episodes, and building up all this detail.
I love the camera with the hair trigger photographing the attack, because it's clearly signposted when in his first scene Simmons goes, "Oh, by the way, do you know anyone that can repair a camera with a dodgy trigger?" But I thought, when he was going to be attacked, I thought, that's clever. They're going to get pictures, aren't they? And I thought that was really good when they did the little slideshow with the pictures and the tape that he was recording as well. I thought that was good. That showing bits of the creature, the killer he's credited as, isn't he?
In fact, I'm glad you've raised that, because I'm amazed actually I've not mentioned it, because it is one of my favourite bits. Is that sequence where they watch the film, when they watch those photographs with the soundtrack accidentally recorded by the tape recorder,
It's very good.
That is a brilliantly put together scene.
It's very unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially it ends on that final line from the doctor, who says, it sounds like he's laughing.
Yeah.
It's a really chilling moment. That
one of Pat Gorman's very few on-screen credits.
That is true. Pat Gorman, for people who don't know him, was a very busy character actor at BBC Television Centre especially in the 60s and 70s.
He did ITV as well. It wasn't just exclusively BBC. He'd work for anybody for anything. Apparently, he loved doing the background work and wasn't interested in the limelight. So it's quite good that he got an on-screen credit, I think.
He does a very effective sort of physical performance in the bits we see of him. I love the whole attack on the Coast Guard sequence. The moment when his arm smashes through the door and it's kind of groping around looking for the handle.
Yeah,
I think that's a lovely little moment.
I saw that David Wiltshire was partly inspired by the film of The Thing from Another World, and obviously Douglas Camfield directed the Doctor Who story Seeds of Doom, which was influenced by The Thing from Another World as well. Like the bit when the Coast Guard goes out foolishly on his own to sort out their gas supply for the heating. He goes into the boiler room, he puts the shotgun down, the creature's stalking him, and he's setting fire to it, because doesn't the monster get set fire to in The Thing from Another World?
He does.
That's right. Yep.
It's a very good homage and a great imagery. And again, Camfield's camera work and editing and the music make effective use of that, don't they?
Yes, I mean, burning monsters have been with us since Frankenstein. It's one of those great images. The burn, especially often the monster gets up again after that.
Well, of course. In fact, I was going to say, speaking of the Coast Guards, did you recognise 2 of them, Gareth or Ian?
Yes, I did. Watching it again in retrospect is quite horrific, seeing what's happening to popular characters from other shows, isn't it?
Yes. Reg Hollis from The Bill and Dad from Bread.
Yeah, Freddie Boswell,
Yeah, that was his name. I couldn't remember it. In fact, I wonder how many of the cast were actually Scottish, because obviously Maurice Roeves was Scottish, and James Cosmo, we know, he's Scottish. I looked Celia Imrie up, and apparently her dad was Scottish. So I don't know if anyone else was, because it was filmed in Cornwall, that well-known Scottish county.
I must say, I think he does a good job. I mean, what do you think? What do you think of the kind of the look of the show?
It feels like an island because we're at sector. We see the coast and everything. We see the ships arriving. And enough Scottish cast or Scottish accents sell it for me. It does feel claustrophobic. Again, my only other negative, and I really enjoyed the program. Some of the daylight fog effects, the filter and the fog machine don't quite look right to me. They just kind of look like fake fog, which it was. But apart from that, most of the time it looks very effective and feels suitably. They're trapped on the island. They can't get police reinforcements. The telephone line gets cut. They're stuck on this island, aren't they, because of the fog? And this killer that Inspector Inskip calls a loony, lunatic killer. It's very atmospheric. It's more tense than the two Doctor Who stories that kind of Camfield did before.
What do you feel about the production, Ian? The general sort of the look of it compared to other shows of the time?
I think it's a perfect example of how if you're canny with the way you provide information, you don't need an awful lot of it to convince the audience of the location. As we say, it's we're immediately convinced that it is a Scottish island, and after that it's fine. The fog is a little bit perhaps too enthusiastic and unnatural at times, but that's okay. And I can imagine people who actually lived in Port Isaac in Cornwall would be shouting at the screen saying that's obviously not Scotland. I know. I'm the same. I was the same when I was watching Russell T Davies's It's a Sin recently, and Bolton was standing in for London. I was going, that's not London. But I think for absolutely everybody else who watches it, perfectly convincing. And I think it was very, very cleverly done.
Oh, speaking of a look, I noticed it was all shot on outside broadcast video, which escaped that 70s, 80s problem of outside looking different to inside scenes, between the film and video. Because when I was a child, I noticed the difference when I was watching TV programs, but I didn't know why. My parents didn't know why it looked different either. So, when I became a Doctor Who fan and learned about the difference between film and video, I knew straight away, this childhood mystery was solved. And in some ways, obviously, film looks better and is more prestigious, but I think the video just about works on this because, they weren't doing everything on video by this point, were they, at the BBC? So I believe they did all videos so they could do the handheld shots of the monsters' point of view better using a video camera rather than a film.
I think it helps when you're on location as well, doesn't it? Rather than trying to convince that a studio interior is actually an exterior.
Oh, that's true. It's all on location, isn't it? You're right.
Yeah, so that does help, I think.
Going on location, it's funny. The podcast I recorded before this, which is about Star Cops, and I was complaining how flat everything looks on video whenever they do the Earth scenes, and that's absolutely not a problem with the Nightmare Man. It feels very much steeped in atmosphere, and even though it's all on, as you say, OB video, it actually doesn't look a million miles away from actual British horror films of the time, particularly the ones that are set in actual modern day Britain.
True. I think if you know the difference between film and video, you'll notice it, but you're right, it doesn't look that bad. It doesn't look cheaper, and like you're saying with Star Cops, it's kind of down to your lighting, isn't it? And whoever's in charge of that, because Star Cops was made 86, 87. Chris Boucher, the creator, originally believed the exteriors were going to be done on film, but the producer decided to do them on video. So again, it just shows that not all BBC productions were doing one medium only for indoor and outdoor scenes, were they?
Yeah, in fact, what the Nightmare Man does make me think of, I don't know if you agree with this, it makes you think of Tygon films. This somehow feels not a million miles away from the like of Doomwatch and The Beast in the Cellar.
Yeah, which of course Doomwatch had James Cosmo in it as well. So,
did it?
Yeah.
Was that a remote Scottish island as well?
It was.
Where the island was.
what with that and the Wicker Man, I'm surprised anybody visits any Scottish islands, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think Summer Isle has a tourist information office, or if it does,
No.
I wouldn't go there.
Don't think you can go wrong with Scottish islands or Cornish fishing villages or anything like that. They just, the sea, the rocks, the harbour, seagulls screeching overhead, and whatever moors in the background. It's instant atmosphere. So, it's can't go wrong.
There's also the thing with I forgot her name, Shelia Anderson's character Fiona. There's that bit about she's kind of not married to the island, but when David talks about marrying her, she says, "I don't think I could ever leave the island again." So like he said, "I'll be marrying you and the island," to suggest it's kind of close knit community. Not that they're inbreds or anything, but just that they've all got this attachment, haven't they, to the place, where us who live in towns or cities, we don't have that attachment in the same way.
In fact, yes, I was going to ask you, Ian, about, because we're talking about the look of the show, but I think how do you feel about the sort of the community of this island and the way it's conjured up in the writing?
I think that's very effective. You do get the feeling that everybody knows each other, and it's quite refreshing that there aren't really any great scandals or gossip. There's no animosity. It seems like a happy island that people know each other. They're able to make a little bit of fun of each other at times, a little bit of banter, and that's absolutely fine. It feels very real. And what I particularly love is the fact that the character of Fiona, although she works in the post office, she's got this sideline of producing maps for the tourist trade, and it gives her a very real reason to get stuck in and be involved in the actual story itself, rather than just being the main guy's girlfriend.
That is good, because the monster never even comes after her. So you're right, it's quite progressive, her role.
Yeah, that was a mild surprise to me, again, because I hadn't seen it in a long while. Watching it again, I was a little surprised that there's no scene, there isn't a bit where Fiona becomes the target of the killer, which you'd be expecting normally at the climax. That would be the way you'd go with it. It doesn't happen. And I like this little community. It's a place where, deaths matter. Every death, in some ways it's a relatively low body count compared to some horror films, but each of those deaths is felt and noticed in this community, even though they are relative outsiders.
Yeah, I like the sort of humor in the gossiping ladies of the island discussing what the police are up to and everything. In fact, a lot of the dialogue feels natural. And especially when, like, Inskip and the others are discussing things, they make jokes and quips about things, don't they?
There is a moment it may be sort of accidental, because there is a certain phrase that has become a bit of a joke, but it's this. But back in 81, it wasn't, when somebody looks at somebody else and says in all earnestness, "There's been a murder."
Yes, Taggart came to mind. It was said twice by somebody, and James Cosmos said it almost the third time, but he said something like, "There's been another killing." So, there's been a murder in the Scottish accent. Bingo! We only get two lines there, two squares. But yeah, you're right. I thought it's going to be like Taggart. So I'm glad it's not just me that spotted that.
I also quite like all the that nice little scene when they're looking at the body doing the autopsy, and Dr. Gaudry says a little bit about he brought Fiona into this world, and
exactly, the close-knit community.
That's it, and he feels a bit of sort of paternal responsibility. So he's kind of sounding Michael out, which of course he then points out himself.
Speaking of Michael, this is going back to my previous podcast of the Uninvited, is that the main character is a professional of some kind, Gareth.
Mm.
And now I
Well,
know David Wiltshire wanted to make the dentist a hero because that's what he did for a living. But again, it's interesting. Would he have had as much weight or validity to the audience if he'd been, I don't know, a greengrocer?
But also the fact that he's a dentist, again, that gets worked into the plot quite effectively as well. I think it's quite funny that he wants dentists to be seen in a more heroic light in fiction in general. That's quite amusing, but at least it doesn't end up being completely random. He manages to get involved in a believable way.
He contributes. It's that innocent caught up in the thing, isn't it? Like a Hitchcock film.
Yeah.
And then he's helpful to the case as well because of the teeth thing, and his girlfriend's helpful because of the maps and the photographs.
It's lucky. It contributes, but thankfully, it's not he resists that urge to make the vital cue. I mean, we get a clue with the dental, with that dental mode, but the whole story doesn't hang on a bit of dentistry at the climax, which only a dentist could carry this out.
I was going to say one other thing that has probably slightly dated it is that in almost every single scene, Inskip is smoking, and so's his sergeant. They're smoking at work while they're working, and also Inskip when he's outside, he lights up, and I just kind of forgotten how commonplace smoking was now. It was then compared to now. It's interesting.
It's true. It's true. The amount of sort of casual smoking in this series, it now leaps out at you. Something else that leapt out to me was the amount of whiskey that gets consumed.
Yes. Well, it is Scotland.
It just becomes like I mean, there's none of this. Oh, not whilst I'm on duty, obviously, on the island of Inverdee, because it seems to lubricate most conversations.
I think the closing lines of the entire thing are actually the two policemen discussing how the lot of a policeman is a difficult one, whilst they're both reclining chairs, quaffing whiskey.
It is right, and I think they do make an effective double act to the point where I think I'd have loved to have seen Inspector Inskip and Sergeant Karch investigating. I could just see him investigating ordinary crimes as well.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the atmospherics, but episode 4 takes a slightly strange turn in that suddenly we're in bright sunlight, and it doesn't feel like we've worked towards this. It doesn't feel like it's the dawn at the end of the or at least it doesn't feel that artistic. But suddenly we're out in broad sunny daylight. I don't know if you agree. It's a problem.
Yeah, I think the last sequence with the Nightmare Man appearing on the golf course with the Major seems slightly wrong in various ways. It is overlit, and then everything's over incredibly quickly, and it doesn't seem all that difficult to put him out of his misery anyway. So I don't know if that comes down to production problems, whether or not they did intend to do that somewhat differently, because it is less effective. It reminds me in that respect of the Doctor Who story, The Leisure Hive, which I think would have been a hell of a lot more effective with the lurking mafia monsters if they'd have been in shadow. And I think it's the same with this.
It's part of the kind of the rules of the horror game. At some point, you've got to show the monster properly. You can keep teasing the viewer, as they do, with little glimpses. But I think the audience feels cheated if they don't see the monster by the end. So it has to happen. But I agree. It's weird. I fully agree. I think it's over far too quickly. I think if they just pumped a few more bullets into him and he kept on going, as it is, it just seems like someone with a pistol could have ended this story.
Yeah.
The episode 2. I mean, I know from the notes that in the book, it all takes place in a wood at night.
That's
It
right,
could well
yeah.
be they felt that was impractical to do, but it's because the pace and the look has been so good up to now that ending weirdly fumbles the ball.
You're right. It does feel like it's over a bit too quickly.
It
And
still looks good.
Yes.
The monster still looks.
It does actually look, he look again. It's tying in with the submarine. It looks practical. It looks believable. He looks like a pilot of some kind, and he's got those marvelous kind of blank goggles together with the horse breathing and everything. So he's actually, I say, he's actually fairly well realised. I was kind of looking at it with a bit of my writer's head on and thinking how, if it has to be on this golf course, perhaps if he'd been kind of going around picking off a few soldiers sort of from behind before he kind of gets to the major.
Yep, and of course the other problem is that he spent 3 episodes gorily ripping people apart, and then he finishes off the major with a bit of a gentle throttle.
That's another double. I mean, they could, I suppose, in story terms. I don't think they ever quite establish in the way that he's dying. That this Nightmare Man, he's slowly dying over the course of the whole of the whole series. In a way, he's been wounded. He's just so strong. He just kept going. I love that phrase, a gentle throttle. That's a good phrase. That
possibly the best way to go. Well,
I was going to say I like the way that when it was revealed that Colonel Howard was really a Russian and the others were there to cover it up. He wasn't like a bad guy Russian as you would expect in the Cold War era. He was genuinely there, obviously under suspicious circumstances, but he generally wanted to help and agreed to stay on the island after taking the Vodyanoi away to get rid of the Nightmare Man to solve the problem for the island. And obviously he didn't want to cause an international incident with the toxic chemical weapon that was in the Vodyanoi infecting the islanders. So he had the sort of anti-agent or vaccine, didn't he? And it was just good that he was a good Russian, I suppose.
Especially at the time, that was very much against stereotype.
Exactly, I like that.
Yes, I think James Newick does a good job with him, Colonel Howard. Sorry, actually, I've been calling him Major Howard. In fact, I've demoted the days. Colonel Howard.
I think he's Major in the novel.
He is.
That's right. That's what I'm getting.
But yeah, I wonder why they changed the rank. But yeah, they got real Royal Marines in, didn't they? Too.
I think that works in their favour as well, because I do get distracted sometimes by watching soldiers on film and television who are so clearly not soldiers, either in the way they move or the length of the hair or the amount of pies they've eaten over the last year. It's really nice to see soldiers that actually look like the real deal.
Again, that's the Douglas Camfield thing, because when he did Doctor Who, they arranged real soldiers to help bulk out the unit soldiers in the invasion, and did they help in Seeds of Doom? I can't remember. Or did we only see two members of the unit?
Been a while
but they definitely used a real army in the invasion, and that was a Camfield directed story.
But yeah, they do look effective when they come ashore in their landing rafts. Episode 4. That does look.
And like Ian said, they move like soldiers. They act like soldiers.
There's a nice little scene of them trotting down the streets of the village, and it looks really effective. A couple of instances of other films from previously that it put me in mind of. Yeah, one was the major, or colonel, I should say, wandering around clearly knowing more than he ought to, and at times being quite terse. And he reminded me quite a lot of Christopher Lee in Night of the Big Heat, which again is supposedly set on an island which is under the cosh from unusual attackers. And the
Mm.
other thing was the camera trigger and the camera taking photographs of the attack reminded me very much of Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue. If you've ever seen that.
Oh, do you know,
I've
I
not
haven't.
seen that one.
That is a film I would love to see. I haven't seen
Oh,
it yet.
yeah, strongly advise it. And a similar sort of thing happens where a photographer gets done in and his camera reveals what he's been done in by, which I think is really effective. It's done in a different way. I'm not necessarily suggesting that they've nicked the idea, but it did. It immediately reminded me of it. Yeah.
It's interesting. According to the Andrew Pitcher's notes, there was some talk about turning it into a film, and I can certainly see it as a film. I think you could easily have transposed it to America if necessary, and another sort of small community somewhere on the
Yeah,
coast.
I think it would be great as long as it didn't get too big a budget, if you know what I mean, and then
Mm.
they could over egg the pudding. Really, I think
Mm.
the isolated community and just the hints of the monster. I think that's great. There's a kind of a well shot, low budget film. It could be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there is something essentially B movie about the Nightmare Man in a good way.
Yeah,
Yeah. So in fact, I shall ask you first, Ian. Would you like to some final thoughts on the Nightmare Man?
I think it's inspired by a novel that very few people have heard of, which seems a shame in itself. It's never been repeated, and I can't really understand why, and therefore people haven't really heard much of the TV serial. I think it's got its faults, but I think it stands up really well. Um, and at the moment, over the last year or so, I've been very much enjoying introducing my daughter, who's just turned 8, to quite a few of the TV and films of yesteryear that obviously try to keep them appropriate with her only being 8. But she's enjoyed watching old Doctor Who with me. She's enjoyed watching
Ah,
some Universal and early Hammer films. But interestingly enough, she got halfway through this one. It did really make her think, "Oh, I do want to still watch this, but could we leave it for another night before we watch the rest, Daddy?" So
ah.
it it's clearly got something which it still works, and people always look back and say things are dated, but it's got a lot to offer. This, I think, it's a great atmosphere, it's a great cast, and it's really well directed and well scripted.
How about yourself, John?
Apart from having the twist revealed to me in a magazine article from 20 years ago, I still enjoyed it. The cast was great, the atmosphere was great, the editing, the camera work, and everything, and even with those little minor things like the fog or the Vodyanoi looking a bit cheap, and the rushed ending, it's still very enjoyable, very atmospheric, and you kind of felt like they were real people in this weird situation. And like Ian said, it is a shame it's not more well known.
So, how's it been publishing your first book, Ian?
Very exciting, it has to be said. But also at times it was a bit of a war of attrition to get it completed. It took about 2 years, what with the day job as well. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. Always been a massive fan of Jenny Agutter, so it was very much a labour of love to spend 2 years watching all of the films,
Mm-hmm.
60 plus of them. So it took up a lot of my time, but it was it was a great thrill.
It's a splendid looking book, I have to say. It's got it's a lot of rare photographs that you've managed to uncover, and some quite films I'd never heard of. Were there any films that really surprised you?
The thing that surprised me more than anything was the way in which she was able to shift from one distinct persona to another. We very much see her as an English rose, but at the same time, there's very much that sort of sex symbol element as well. And yet, I think more than any other actress I can think of, she seemed to just keep skipping from one to the other without it bothering anybody whatsoever. So we were going from a first couple of films which were very much cute child roles, and then straight into things like I Start Counting and Walkabout. And in between those two being released, you've got the Railway Children. Very diverse, and it always fascinated me that she managed to get away with that.
Do you have any? Has it inspired you? Have you got any more books in the pipeline that you can talk about?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I do work quite closely with Eric McNaughton, who publishes the We Belong Dead magazine and releases a lot of books about horror films. I contribute to a lot of those, and he was kind enough to support me on this first solo release, and it has gone well. There are still books available should anybody wish to search them out, but it's sold well. It looks like I'll be going solo again on the films of Robert Shaw sometime in the near future. So we'll be looking at Jaws and The Deep and Force 10 from Navarone and so on. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, he's an absolutely brilliant actor. I think that should be a really interesting project. That one.
Yeah, especially as he was quite local as well, wasn't he? To those of us that live in the northwest. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I think it only remains for me to say thank you very much to Ian and John for joining me to talk about The Nightmare Man.
Thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Great stuff. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it immensely too. I hope you have listening at home and look forward to talking to you again soon. Goodbye for now. That was Very British Futures, hosted by Gareth Preston, with guests Ian Taylor and John Isles. Music by Chattery Art. You can hear more of his work at chatteryart.bandcamp.com. Follow us on Twitter at FuturesVery, and for more reviews and news, visit garethpreston.blog. Next time, Out of the Unknown.